Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It's Thursday, January 30th. That's right. January 30th, 2020. Not yet the last day of January. January is really dragging on, it seems to me at this point, but almost there. Friday, tomorrow, will be the last day of January. And then we're done with this stupid month. And then it's less than a year until we're inaugurating a new president. I mean, it is actually now anyway because it's January 20th. But okay. The point is, I was looking for something to say that might be somewhat upbeat. We are embroiled, of course, still in the impeachment so-called trial. It's going on. Yesterday was the first day of the question period, and I think we were all suitably disappointed in our Senate for the most part. Yesterday, don't know if there was a real upbeat highlight moment. It was very interesting to sort of watch senators feel their way around the question and answer-ish period, and a lot of revealing things. I guess there were plenty of lowlights, that's for sure. I wasn't expecting too much out of the question and answer period. There were actually a couple of good-ish questions, and in fact, there were Republicans who I thought asked good questions, and then the rest of them were terrible. And I guess Murkowski and Collins got together on one. I think they may have had a third partner in all of this. But early on, they put actually a pretty good question. I thought things were going to break down for them, and they did. For the most part, senators figured out that they really weren't going to get any opportunity for gotcha questions to the other side. They just really weren't likely to trap anybody. And I mean, despite the temptation to highlight the lies or the stupidity or the disingenuousness of the other side, very rarely were you going to get in a situation where that other side gets 5 uninterrupted minutes to answer you, an answer that would satisfy you if you were looking for the gotcha thing. Now, that didn't stop Ted Cruz and who was his partner in this? I can't even remember now off the bat who it was. Oh, yeah, Lindsey Graham. Lindsey Graham and Ted Cruz kept teaming up to try and get the House managers painted into a corner, and it never really did work. Adam Schiff was able to dunk on him once or twice, and it's just not good trial advocacy thinking, strategy to, well, for one thing, they tell you never ask any questions that you don't know the answer to, not in court anyway. And this isn't court, and you can just deny it, and you can go back out and make statements on C-SPAN that negate the answer that you were given and level personal attacks to people who gave you the answers, etc. But by the same token, Democrats were not likely to be able to trap the president's counsel because they'll just answer the way they want. Isn't it true that President Trump did this, and this, and all of these things are established by the record, and he may have admitted to them on videotape, and they might play the videotape, but the president's counsel will just say no, or you misinterpret all those things, or that's okay, and that's when you realize, oh yeah, you're not allowed to just interrupt and say, aha, but, so it wasn't a great game. However, I did see Senators Collins and Murkowski. What was their question? I think they asked they asked their own side in this one. They asked the president's counsel whether there were any instances that they could point to of the president being concerned about corruption in Ukraine before he became interested in getting information about Burisma or the Bidens. In other words, before Biden began his bid for the presidency. And they really couldn't. And it was Pat Philbin answering for them, trying to come up with an answer. And he did the best he could, was to say, well, we weren't developing a record of what the president was doing before this situation arose. So because no record was developed, it's not our fault. We are not the ones that developed the record. The House developed the record, and they developed an incomplete record of what the president may or may not have been doing before a certain period of time. They developed a record that demonstrated, they hoped, his guilt rather than his actual innocence. And so it's not really our fault. It's their fault. But no, I don't have any. And that was kind of interesting. That was probably the best gotcha question I've seen, and it was to their own side. So, I mean, I guess that will play. I don't know whether it was genuine or not. Maybe they hoped that it would play well at home where they were in trouble for not being open or moderate, as they like to say to the people who vote for them for whatever reason they believe it. And they'll just turn around at the end, Lucy and the football, and just do what they want to do or whatever. But it was one of the highlights, I thought, of the questioning period. The lowlights were many more in number, and I'm sure Greg has some ideas about what some of those were, but we'll get to 5% or so of them, probably. Good morning, Greg. How are you?
Good morning. So, the lowlight was whenever Alan Dershowitz opened his mouth.
Oh, yeah, that's definitely on the bottom of the list in terms of the lights.
Pat Cipollone was neutral. I think Philbin probably did the best job in terms of sounding like an adult.
Yes.
But of course, the highlight was Schiff. And every time they put a question to Schiff that they thought was going to be a gotcha, in fact, he kind of ate their lunch. So I think they stopped asking him questions after a while.
Yeah, they were not good at that.
They were not very good at that. So some of the questions, and there was something like 81 questions. I didn't count all of them, but and I certainly didn't listen to all of them. I went in and out. But the first question was from Collins and Murkowski. And they asked about whether the president had raised corruption issues related to Joe Biden before. Oh, that wasn't the first question. The first question was, can somebody have multiple motivations? Which sparked a bit of a question. My favorite response to that actually was on Twitter. Oh. Jeffrey Dahmer said, listen, it's true that I was a murderous cannibal and I ate those people, but on the other hand, it was lunchtime.
Right. Yeah, sure. Plus, they were...
So I had multiple motivations.
National interest.
You can't indict me.
That's right. Yeah, that was a real low light. We'll take that apart if no one else does. Yes.
But so that was kind of dumb. And of course, Dershowitz basically saying Richard Nixon's stuff out loud, if the president does it, it's not illegal. That was certainly a low light and got everybody paying attention and actually everybody fairly outraged. So there was that. But Collins and Murkowski did ask jointly if the president had raised corruption issues related to Joe Biden before the former vice president declared he was running for president. And Romney asked Philbin to say what date the U.S. aid to Ukraine was held up and whether the president gave a reason at that time, and then tried to get a timeline as to when he knew that he was talking about Biden. And Philbin couldn't really put a timeline on it. In other words, it was pretty clear, and I don't think it was Romney's intent to do this, but it was pretty clear that Trump only became interested in Burisma when it became clear that Biden was running.
Yes.
That's not what they wanted, but that's what they clearly established.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't likely to come out any other way. I mean, by the measure of corruption in Ukraine, Burisma's corruption is de minimis, you might say, and Hunter Biden's connection. Even if you accept it as fact that any money he was paid was corrupt by definition, this is no way to start in seriously about corruption in Ukraine. You're talking about 1/100,000th of the size of serious corruption issues in Ukraine. Doesn't make the top 1,000 list.
No, it's not all that interesting. And I don't know the full story of Hunter Biden. I know he's sort of a troubled figure there, but doesn't he have a law degree from Yale?
Who knows? I think everybody does at this point.
But the point is that if you're going to look at who gets on boards and what do, he's hardly unique in that regard.
That is definitely true. I did see a lot of...
and he's more qualified than most, is what I'm saying.
Right. Yeah, I would say so. There was somebody was pointing out, I guess Pam Bondi has a similar situation, paid by Qatar, I think, as a lobbyist in some area in which she professes no expertise, but whatever.
Yeah,
Money, I'll
right.
take
And she makes more than he does. So what's his point?
Yeah.
What's her point? I don't get it. And the other part of
What's
it, of
his
course,
point?
came out when
It's
we were
asking
talking
too.
about witnesses.
Yes.
And we still don't, that's obviously the key question at this particular point. It looks like there'll be more questioning today. We don't know how long or how dumb or how boring or
yes.
how interesting. We don't know that
We
yet.
could ask that. That's a good question.
And then the next day,
How boring.
Friday, will be the witness vote, which
Yes.
Republicans feel like they have a handle on. And then will acquittal be Friday night or Saturday morning, both of which are not good viewing times. So that's the biggest question that they're going to have to juggle. But you'd think that if it was all set and everybody was sure what was going on, then you wouldn't hear all of the chatter yesterday about two subtexts with witnesses. What if Mitt Romney, Lisa Murkowski, and Susan Collins vote, I want witnesses? It's a 50-50 tie, and then does Roberts break the tie, and how does that work? And will he? Or won't he? He'll be overruled, of course. But that's a dicey situation that just doesn't look good for the Republicans. It doesn't look good for the Republicans if a single vote is for witnesses and they say no, because the cover-up will be clear, and then the cover-up is what's going to drive things between now and the election as new facts come out. So if they think it's over, they're dumb. The other subtext with the witnesses is you still heard all day yesterday, if the Democrats call Bolton, we'll call Schiff, the Bidens, and the whistleblower, as if that's some kind of a threat that's supposed to scare people, which it obviously isn't. They don't want Schiff up there any more than, than they can shut him down, because he's been the Democrats' most effective articulate advocate. So they certainly don't want Schiff. The Bidens have nothing to say. And the whistleblower, I don't think, would be allowed. But, whatever. If they think that that's a threat, why are they making threats if they have the votes? I just don't get that part.
Well, I mean, they're just sort of used to it, maybe. That's just the way they live their life. If they're breathing, they're making threats, I suppose.
Right. Meanwhile, Lev Parnas said yesterday that a lot of this correspondence between Giuliani and the Ukrainian corrupt people, he saw Giuliani deliver this to Lindsey Graham. So there's yet another juror that's tainted.
Yes, well, no one cares about that anymore. I mean, people do.
Yeah, I mean, but that's
no one's going to stop it.
That's just the part of the drip that comes out.
Yeah.
I mean, the public gets it. They understand. They want witnesses, and they know that Trump did something wrong, and the majority of the public says that. And that's not going to go away or somehow be reversed with a train. Get on the train and acquit him. It's not going to be exculpatory. It's not going to help Trump the way he thinks it's going to. All it's going to do is piss off Democrats and drive votes in November.
Yes. Well, I'm okay with that. That may be the best outcome you can get out of this.
That's pretty much what I'm looking for. So
all right.
I would be
I'll
disappointed if we don't have witnesses. I think it's just good for norms and rule of law. And I hate the precedent being set that if a Republican president does it, it's not illegal. If a Democratic president does it, of course it is. I mean, that's basically what they're saying. I think even Philbin at some point said, it's like Bush v. Gore. It only counts for this election.
Yes. Although, they were admirably narrow, actually, in that decision compared to what they're arguing for now. But yes, if we're lucky, it comes out that way.
Right, but I don't know. I don't know that that's the case. So that's basically what went down yesterday.
A few more.
And, a lot of people are scratching their heads saying, I don't know what Dershowitz was talking about. That doesn't sound right. And at the same time, I don't understand, not just me, many people. This is Jim Swift, who's a conservative, writes at The Bulwark. At this point, I don't get why the GOP position that calling Adam Schiff as a witness is helpful to them. He's been far more effective than everybody but Patrick Philbin. Why give him more time? That's dumb.
Yeah, that's a pretty good conclusion. I would stick by that one. Good for you. Who was it? Him, you guy.
Philbin. That was Jim Swift that said that.
Okay, yes.
So the other thing, there was rumor, I didn't get this verified by anybody other than seeing it come across Twitter, that Rand Paul tried to ask a question 100%. Specifically about the whistleblower and his identity, and Roberts wouldn't allow it.
Yes, I did hear about that too, and I think I put an article aside about it. But it's not.
He actually did something.
He did do something.
Like he moved. He's
right.
not a statue.
Yeah, they finally. I was discussing this morning just at home and just saying I think they finally found something that Roberts was not going to let Republicans get away with, and of course it was Rand Paul that did it, and he insists that he's going to keep fighting and find a way to do it anyway, and I don't know exactly how he intends to, but. Yeah, I guess once he realized that the role here is that the Chief Justice has to read out loud whatever we write down and read it into the record, and on C-SPAN, I'm going to put the name of the whistleblower in there and have it read out loud. And, no, I'm not going to do that. What do you do with that one? I mean, also, I think there were a lot of Republicans who were displeased with that too, and he vowed to fight, and then I think he got the message that, the only way to fight is to vote. And I'm used to being the guy who brings up those votes, and everybody votes with me on my side, and we win by sheer numbers, no matter whether it's fair or realistic. And then I will lose here. What do I do in a situation where I lose? I don't know. I guess I'll go home now. Bye.
Spend more time with your family.
Yeah.
Chris Murphy
tweeted,
it's all out in the open now. The President's Council just argued there's nothing wrong with any candidate for office soliciting dirt on their opponents from foreign countries. They're not even trying to fake it anymore. The argument they used is if the president thinks it's in his national interest, and obviously it's in the national interest for him to win an election, therefore, whatever the president does to win an election is fine.
Yes. The most damaging part of Dershowitz's testimony for the day, it really was testimony, was the idea that, well, every politician in America thinks getting elected is in the national interest, otherwise they wouldn't run. So therefore, anything that they do in furtherance of getting elected is, in their mind anyway, in the national interest. And they took that and ran with it. Anyone who worries
but they have
about,
to, because they have no defense. I mean, it's pretty clear at this point that Trump did it. So now what they're latching on to is, of course he did it, but so what?
Yeah,
I mean, which we all knew that we're going to get to, but it's just weird to see it put this way.
It is weird.
And it's damaging.
It took an extra
damaging
step.
Way beyond Trump.
I think we've all known for a long time that they were going to retreat to the he did it, but so what? I don't know how many people definitely predicted clearly that they were going to go further than that and say, not only did he do it, but good, you should be glad he did. That was the most patriotic thing he possibly could have done, and the Constitution demands that he do it.
Right. So Adam Goldman, New York Times, sums it up here in a tweet. The impeachment calculation nearly all GOP senators are making is simple. They'd rather look as if they ignored evidence, which, of course, they are, than plunge the Senate into an unpredictable, open-ended inquiry that would anger Trump and court political peril. To Senate Republicans, a vote for witnesses is a vote for trouble. Well, of course it is, because he's guilty and more stuff would come out.
Yeah. And that's just that's true. And it's
not even
related to the witnesses.
On its face, straightforward. So let's not pretend that it's anything other than, that calculation. This isn't the trial. They're not looking at it fairly. That's never been what's going on. The thing is, because the public wants witnesses, their calculation has to be balanced against the fact that they really, 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 really look bad to their constituents. And for those like Collins who are up for election, they can't have that. So Collins needs the outcome of no witnesses, but I voted for witnesses. And that's why I think she's a yes vote. Romney, I think, just plain old wants witnesses, but everybody hates Romney. So not the way they hate Cruz. They hate Cruz personally. They just think Romney's an outsider and not really part of the club. So they're not going to listen to him when he says to them, I really think we need witnesses. It's the right thing to do. Right. What are you talking about? Right thing. What are you nuts? Don't talk here.
Oh, wow.
What are you? Mr. Smith comes to what? Get out of here. So I think there's those two votes. I don't know what Murkowski will do. She voted against Kavanaugh. There are times that she will do the right thing. That leaves three. Alexander, everybody's looking at Alexander. Alexander is the one senator that didn't ask questions yesterday.
Is that right?
So everybody will watch him if he does ask a question today. And then, although it's highly likely that there are no witnesses and it's over by Friday evening or Saturday morning, Alexander's still a wild card, because if he votes for witnesses, he'll bring 2 or 3 people with him, if not more. So I think he's the key vote at this particular point in time. I'm guessing he votes with his good friend Mitch McConnell, because they really are besties, but I don't know. And they don't know, and that's why they keep, on the one hand, talking about 50-50 votes and what does it mean if Roberts has to actually, move and not be a statue, and the other side is threatening with all these witnesses, and hell will break loose, and we'll get Obama up here, and this and that, and all this other nonsense. If they had the votes locked down totally, they wouldn't be doing that.
That's true. They would probably just they could sit quietly and just wait it out. And
So thank you for bringing that up. That's the last factor in all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Senators hate sitting there quietly.
That's true.
The reason they want the trial over is they hate this. You have to sit there under pain of imprisonment, says the morning, startup. And you have to sit there and listen. They don't want to sit there and listen. They want to be in front of a camera talking.
Right.
They're important people. How dare you tell them to sit there and listen? And now you're saying you have to sit there and listen for another week? That's not going to happen. We're important.
That's really bothering them. They might be enjoying the question and answer period a little bit.
I don't think so.
No, you don't think so? They get their names read out loud, and they get.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so. They want to talk. They want to ask the question themselves. They want to look in the camera.
Oh, that's true.
They want to furrow their
yes.
brow.
They
want to
get to
look
do that.
troubled. They don't want to just have it read out by somebody else.
I guess that's probably true. Although I did think that there's some really interesting notes from the roll call reporters. Well, actually, some interesting and some not interesting. If you really like the minutia, they literally taking notes like so and so blew their nose at a certain point, and what color was
it? Was the seventh
handkerchief?
time today they did that.
Yeah.
Whereas this other senator over here, he only scratched his nose once, so obviously it's a difference. But it's regional.
They did, yes, that's true. They did observe all those differences. They did enjoy the question and answer period more than they've enjoyed sitting silently. They were noticeably more animated. They were working together. They were huddling on things, and I guess they were allowed their electronics back, and people must have been texting them questions or something.
The senator from Alaska has a cold. The senator from Florida does not. It's clearly regional.
It's orange juice, all that vitamin C. But I don't know. It's been very interesting watching. I guess they wrap it up today. There were interesting cliques developed. Senators who repeatedly submitted questions together. It was very interesting to see.
Ted Cruz did it with David Perdue. It was, there were some other people
one.
that these questions came and went, and these groups came and went. But for the most part, as
fluid.
suggested by you, I think before this all started yesterday morning, the Democrats generally asked the House managers, and the Republicans generally asked questions of the White House counsel.
Yes,
and it was unusual when they went cross-party. And when they did, that was some of the more interesting stuff, which, of course, they went out of their way to try to avoid.
Yeah. I also noticed an interesting pattern, and it helped, I think, clear a few things up, especially if you joined in the middle. There was a certain code with the Republican side. Depending on who answered the question, you could tell if you didn't understand, what are you trying to get at here, either with the question or the answer. If Philbin was answering, the question, at least as interpreted by the President's counsel, was aimed at finding a technicality that they could use to invalidate some or all of the impeachment articles and comfortably vote for acquittal. And if, what was the other guy who was answering questions yesterday who spent a good amount of time? I can't even remember. If Sekulow was answering, they were just looking for dirt on Biden. If Dershowitz was answering, it was, I need you to just, completely bamboozle everyone. Give me a constitutional sounding argument that can make me sound like I went to Harvard Law School to vote no.
Right. And if Bondi was talking, it was smearing Hunter Biden.
Yeah. Oh, and another horrible performance for Pam Bondi. I saw it.
It was really weak.
A clip of her.
I thought that Philbin did the best. And,
yes.
And Bondi was probably the worst.
Yes. Also, as you mentioned, Lev Parnas. Maybe, I don't know if we'll get the story in, but did you see the tweets circulating from Ted Cruz and others joking that Lev Parnas had come to the gallery as a guest of Chuck Schumer, but they had to eject him from the gallery because he was wearing the ankle bracelet because he is, of course, under indictment. Right. And they thought that was hilarious, even though it was kind of an own goal, if you will. The reason he's wearing the ankle bracelet is for giving so much dirty money to you. I don't know why you think that's going to bother us. That's your guy that isn't allowed. Plus, then it turns out, the lovely part of it was Ted Cruz tweeted that out with hashtag can't make this up, and then later had to tweet a correction. Lev Parnas had never been in the gallery. Though he had gotten tickets, he and his lawyer, from Chuck Schumer, Lev knew ahead of time that the ankle bracelet would keep him out of the gallery and never bothered trying to enter. But, that's a small bit. But, of course, to insist that he was there and ejected, hashtag can't make it up, hashtag yeah, you just did, was a pretty embarrassing moment. He tweeted a correction, if you will, but you can't get out from under hashtag can't make it up.
Right. Well, my segment's going to end at the end of this half hour. I've got some other chores to do. But, the bottom line here is that things will go along the way the steamroll intends most likely. Mm-hmm. But it's going to be bad news for the Republicans in the long term. If they really think that this is in their benefit, they must have been afraid of some really bad stuff coming out, because this isn't going to be good at all for them. People are going to look at this and say, it's a cover-up, and the Senate didn't do its job, and the partisans on the other side, the House didn't do its job. No, sorry, they did a great presentation, plenty of evidence to convict, but certainly enough evidence to justify witnesses. And Bolton's going to talk, and the book's going to come out, and more stuff is going to come out, and they're going to look foolish.
Yeah, and it's only a matter of time, and I guess, I don't know whether strategically it's better that it happen immediately, or fine, commit them to an exoneration and then have it drip after that.
That's obviously worse. Well, get it all out so that you don't get surprised. Meanwhile, the subject will change a little bit on Monday when we have the Iowa caucuses, and then we're right back to what the Senate didn't do.
Yeah, right. All the things that they're being stopped from doing that was pointed out yesterday, except they didn't tell them there was nothing. All right. Thanks very much, Greg. We'll see you next week. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Networks Radio. How do we even go on without Greg by our side? I don't know. We should have offered to help with his chores and errands and just talk along the way, but I don't know. Maybe I need to get him one of those mobile uplink units like Al Franken used to have, and I could see him wearing one of those around town, right? I don't know if it would make any difference. I don't think you need all that equipment, and you never did, really. But it was a joke. It's a comedy show. Let's just get past it. All right. By the way, a good morning beginning that we missed from Bill in Portland, Maine this morning. His usual startup tweet for us was a good one. I thought they always are, and rarely when we miss them do we double back. But I always feel bad about it because, these things are fun. But I like it. He pointed out it gives us a chance to discuss more about what happened yesterday, of course. Daily Kos Radio is live now. It has been for half an hour at this point, of course. Please note that whatever I do, Kagro X, me, David Waldman, whatever I do today, like, say, rob a bunch of banks. He can't be convicted of any crime because he's doing it in the national interest. And I am. Everything I do is in the national interest, of course. And that is why I rob national banks exclusively, of course. And only, I say, give me the deposits from accounts that are interest-bearing. And that's how I keep myself in the national interest. However, I am aware that Republicans have a broader reading of this well-known law, and simply take everything that's in there. I'm still convinced, of course, that Steve Mnuchin is making off with gold bars from Fort Knox on a weekly basis. I'm positive he's stealing them. No one believes me. That's because I have no proof, and also no serious reason for believing that it's true. But do you really need a serious reason to believe anything in this day and age? I don't think so. Speaking of which, let's see. I mean, I think maybe the best thing to do. I don't know if it was a great day for news reporting on what was going on yesterday. It's, I think there are a couple of items that I put aside, not all of which are directly relevant to yesterday's proceedings. But I think, what I really ought to do is just look through yesterday's Twitter timeline to remind myself of what was going on at the time and what people were talking about, and how we can reflect on it from there. It also gives me an opportunity to look for the Ted Cruz tweet about Lev Parnas and get to that story, and then, of course, provide you with the proof that actually happened if you can't believe it. Although what I could tell you that happened at the trial that you wouldn't believe, I have no idea. It was really rather remarkable yesterday. I think, like Greg was saying, the lowlights almost all came from Dershowitz, which is amazing because, of course, Republicans would say, well, that's where all the highlights came from. They still are reportedly enthralled by his mastery of the subject and his masterful presentations of his theory, minority theory to say the least, that nothing the president can do could possibly be impeachable. In other words, Nixon reborn. That was actually the part of the taxonomy of yesterday's code that you could read by who was giving the answer to a given question. If Philbin is answering the senator's question was, can you tell me the reason why technically, even if Trump, did these things, why, and I think they're wrong. That Philbin was the guy answering questions from senators who were like, well, what if what he did was wrong? How can I vote to acquit him anyway? And Dershowitz was playing the role of, well, how can I avoid saying the president was wrong? If Dershowitz is answering, the senator is looking for an argument explaining why, if the president does it, that means it's not illegal. And he was there to play the role of Nixon's ghost. That's what his job was yesterday. And he did do that. And I guess if that's the job, then he did it well. But as most people realized pretty quickly, he, and then eventually a couple other of the president's counsel, felt more comfortable making these arguments. I did feel like Philbin was the least comfortable with either blatantly lying. He liked to hedge things a little bit. Though he certainly spat out some things that I would say, well, that's not true. That's a lie. But he was a little more careful with it. He was a little more uncomfortable about it. And he was not as willing, certainly as Dershowitz, to go to it doesn't matter what he did. The point is, it was in the national interest because he's a president running for re-election, period. Dershowitz's theory is, as he said, every politician thinks that their election would be in the public interest. Not all of them are right, of course, but the second part of his theory comes close to tautology in that since everyone, of course, thinks that their election is in the public interest, but then the result of the election, of course, if you accept, and it's hard not to. I mean, this is I guess what makes his argument have some power. I mean, assuming no election cheating, and I know you're not allowed to really just assume that anymore, but in the abstract, the theory is an election is decided by the voters, the votes of the people, and you figure out who got the most, and that person wins. And in other words, the result of an election is an expression of the public interest. And so if the result of the election bestows office on you, or anybody, anybody upon whom office is bestowed by virtue of an election has been elected as a reflection of the public interest in having that person represent them. I don't know that voters necessarily think it through that way. It might be more of an assumption about what winning an election means in a democracy than is actually warranted. But you can get away with that one. All right, the public has expressed through their votes an interest in having you represent us, which also is not necessarily, we had a lot of definitional games from Dershowitz. It's not necessarily the case that the public having an interest in seeing you occupy an office is the same thing as your occupancy of it, your exercise of it, is in the public interest. It's two different, at least nuances, if not necessarily a completely different definition of the word interest. But he loved playing at these word games, including, I thought, the largest logical leap that he made, which was his insistence that, how did he put it? I should probably scroll to the discussion from Twitter just to see if I can find my way back to it. But he in furtherance of his theory, he was expanding on not only his definition of what's in the national interest, but I remember what prompted it now. One of the senators, and I think it might have been, I don't know. You know what? I can't recall whether it was a Republican senator, like one of the possible dissenters, or whether it was a Democratic question to the president's counsel, which was kind of risky, but seemed to have sort of worked out. Maybe someone in the audience remembers who asked the question, but I think the gist of the question was, what has happened to you, Dershowitz? What's your problem? In other words, what's changed in the last, I think it was 22 years, between the Clinton impeachment, during which you were fairly certain that certain types of misbehavior in office were definitely impeachable, to bringing you around to this new position that you've discovered that no behavior, no matter how reprehensible in office, can be impeachable because it's all in the public interest, because you have, after all, been elected. And your reelection would likewise be an expression of the public interest. So that was an interesting setup as a question. And that took him to, well, his answer started out like, okay, well, he might be able to get away with this one, if you're way open-minded about things. His answer was essentially, well, I did more reading and more study. And like any academic, your views evolve, and that's okay. And that's what academics do. And every professor, every law professor, any professor of anything ought to be willing to say that. And, okay, well, I can admit that that's a possibility. Although this is a pretty radical shift. And then, he went on to insist, for instance, that Lawrence Tribe, who claims the opposite of what Dershowitz does, he obviously hasn't done, enough reading and study. I'm open. I've been looking. I've been considering the new thinking on this, or rather even the old thinking. What was very interesting, Schiff responded to him later on by saying, and he had an interesting take on it too. You can't say, he said, that Alan Dershowitz is unprepared. There's nothing if not a prepared individual here. But I'm sure he's done plenty of thorough study, but I guess I am doubtful, basically, that even the 1998 Alan Dershowitz was a scholar, right? I mean, the idea that the 1998 Alan Dershowitz hadn't read the debates of the founders from the Constitutional Convention, hadn't read the Federalist Papers, hadn't read, I mean, the founding fathers have not written anything new since 1998. It's all out there. And I mean, it's all canon for a law professor. So the idea, I thought Schiff made a pretty good point there. The idea that a Harvard law professor involving himself in constitutional issues, involving himself in things that rise to the level of a presidential impeachment in 1998 wouldn't have thoroughly reviewed the canon body of writing from the founders on the subject of executive power and the limits on it is difficult to believe. But I guess he did it. And he read something new that has convinced him that they really put the impeachment clause in there by accident. It was superfluous, and there's really no reason to pay it any attention. Although, that's awfully hard to swallow since, of course, one, the clause is in there, and they enumerate specific crimes that should trigger it. And normally we contain ourselves to a discussion over, well, what does high crimes and misdemeanors really mean? At one point, he erases the word high, by the way, and just says, well, that's what goes to my theory of there needs to be a crime here, or crime-like activity. But he gets rid of the word high, which gave the word crimes and the word misdemeanors different meaning under what would have been the founders' understanding of English common law, et cetera, et cetera. I think we've all heard those arguments. But what he got around to saying eventually was, if the president does it, that means it's not illegal. And that must have been the thinking of the founders, because during the course of the Constitutional Convention and the debates afterwards, I guess it didn't come up as much in the debates afterwards because the text that they sent to the states for ratification didn't include it. But in the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia and whatever, the discussions around the drafting of the Constitution, there was at some point the proposed anyway, and I don't know whether they had it in the draft and eliminated it or what, but at some point it was proposed that maladministration be added to the list, that the president could be impeached for treason, bribery, high crimes and misdemeanors, maladministration among them in that list. And the debate, and I think rightly, got around to, well, isn't that a little bit too broad? We don't want a system whereby policy differences as between a president of one persuasion, and I don't think they were thinking necessarily in terms of parties there. They were still trying to avoid that, but they had to be realistic. They must have known that things were going to break down along those lines in one way or another. They were familiar with English parliamentary practice. They had their doubts about the wisdom of party structures, but that's it. They knew about them. Anyway, what they didn't want was a policy disagreement with a majority in the House of Representatives leading to impeachment trials or even removal from office, trial after trial after trial, or removal after removal after removal. They, of course, had a great interest in the stability, long-term stability of the government. That's why they were there. They felt like the Articles of Confederation had failed them on that point. And they didn't want to undo what they thought might be their good work in stabilizing things by having it become a simple thing, or even mandated by the Constitution, to have policy differences rise to the level of forcing a rotating in and out of chief executives every 6 months or whatever they thought might be the breakdown. So their rejection of maladministration, Dershowitz was arguing, was clear that they also meant to reject the concept, which they also didn't put in there in writing, of abuse of power. And of course, abuse of power is core of one of the articles of impeachment, the first article of impeachment. And, necessary and to some extent, to the establishment of the second article. But anyway, the argument here was really rather blatant and a huge logical leap, I thought. And maybe we should check our dictionaries and find out, because it's always a pretty good indication that a constitutional law professor who finds himself in the course of his, at the crux of his argument, saying, well, the dictionary says, the dictionary defines X as blah, 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 blah. Well, we know that things typically go beyond dictionary definitions when we come to constitutional law. But his argument was they rejected maladministration as a basis for impeachment. And maladministration is abuse of power. If you look up maladministration, or I think they did say that. Yeah, if you look up maladministration in the dictionary, it says abuse. And I don't know if that's really true. I mean, it's close enough that I could say, I could see a bad dictionary having that, but let's just see. We'll Google maladministration. And usually if you put the word definition afterwards, you'll get pointed to one of them. Although there's an interesting, the Google search suggestion comes up, maladministration definition and maladministration definition law. And I don't know whether they bring you to different places or different conclusions, but let's see. All right, so these ones that pop up at the front, I don't know what dictionary it is, and I guess it matters for proprietary purposes. Was it Webster's? Is it Merriam-Webster's? Is it what other? Who else is big in the dictionary industry these days? Maladministration, inefficient or dishonest administration, mismanagement. Yeah. Well, sure. What's not in there? Abuse. That's weird. He said it was abuse. And it's not. Here's the Merriam-Webster thing. Corrupt or incompetent administration as of a public office, or incorrect administration as of a drug. That's very interesting. Look, abuse isn't in there. Now, he stood up there and said it was not only the same thing as abuse, but then went on to insist, well, that means that abuse of office, abuse of power, cannot be a basis for impeachment because they rejected the word maladministration. This other word also is rejected. And no, that's not the case at all. I mean, that's just like get the F out of here level kind of response there. Why would you even say that? Well, all right. Why at this point, why are we asking, why do they say things that are demonstrably untrue? I don't know, but they make a habit of doing it. Anyway, it's really not that difficult. What he was hoping to do there was to say, well, you're blurring the lines between maladministration and some of these other things. Maladministration is not a synonym, as he argued, for abuse of power. Maladministration is bad decision-making, and abuse of power is a crime against the country or the body politic, if you really want to get high-minded about it. It is ludicrous to say otherwise. Period. The end. And they're very different things, and I really have no idea why he thought people couldn't distinguish between them. And I finally just said, all right, well, you're going to have to do this for you, obviously. Maladministration, you want to think about things if you're having difficulty making distinctions. And really, that's okay. I mean, he tried to seize on the point that people would have difficulty making distinctions between maladministration and abuse of power or whatever else. And he brought up another term, too, misconduct in office. He said maladministration is the same thing as misconduct in office. And I'm not certain that it is. Actually, I'll say I'm certain that it's not. But are there close calls? Are there cases that blur the lines? Yes, sure. But that doesn't mean that you can't differentiate between them or that the differentiation is invalid. The fact that you're having difficulty deciding where the lines are means that there are lines. And if there are lines, then you're talking about different words. That's it. I win. Now, for a helpful guide, maladministration, it is like when you think tax cuts will pay for themselves, so you implement them, but instead of paying for themselves, they actually cost a tremendous amount of money, and say they push the deficit over $1 trillion, which of course is happening right now. That would be maladministration at a minimum. Now, if there was more surrounding the passage of the if you had bribed members of Congress to pass the tax bill, that would be a separate question. The bribery would be an impeachable, well, it's an impeachable offense. It says so right here. and I guess closer to abuse of power than maladministration. But if you just did it on the up and up, and everybody thought it would be a good idea, but it wasn't, that's maladministration. That's the sort of thing. Now you can begin to understand, why would the founders not want that to be an impeachable offense? And that's because he was trying a policy that he thought would work in good faith, and it didn't work. And that's something that you should solve with an election, not an impeachment. Misconduct in office. That raises a closer question about whether or not you should remove someone from office. It's not a genuine mistake necessarily, but it occupies some middle ground. Here's what I gave by way of example. Misconduct in office is, let's say, when you pardon war criminals so that they can campaign for you. I mean, that is a situation where you're talking about, well, okay, he's got an absolute, what's generally considered to be an absolute pardon power, but aren't there limits of the pardon power? Well, I don't know. And even if there are, this doesn't really seem to fall within it. It's a terrible idea and a terrible precedent, if there is such a thing as precedent for absolute powers. I mean, if they're absolute, who cares what the precedent is? It's an absolute power at the end. Don't tell me what the precedent is. Tell me, does he have the power? But everyone recognizes it as a improper, really. I mean, and not everyone says it's improper, but we all, right? Well, normal people would say it's improper, or they have some questions about it, or really, is that what they really meant it for? And, well, we're not supposed to look into that. The power is pretty clearly plenary, and that's all there is to it. All right, we'll have to accept that there's a pardon granted here to someone who doesn't deserve it for reasons that are not acceptable to us as a society. But it happened, and we have to let it go. All right, well, that's misconduct in office. You might impeach him for that, just in terms of, if you've got the votes. Here is these sorts of gray areas are where the control against overzealous use of the impeachment clause is the elections, that the members of the House and Senate who are, in Dershowitz's nightmare, repeatedly impeaching presidents left and right. Figuratively speaking, but also, they could be left-leaning and right-leaning presidents, but they're removing presidents all the time. That's terrible. And if you don't like it, you would probably start voting for people who say things like, this destabilization is terrible for us. And while I take my constitutional duties seriously and the duties of the president seriously, I don't think we should be impeaching these guys for everything. Let's slow down. And then that person and people like them would probably win a majority of Congress, and it would settle itself. Now, lastly, of course, abuse of power, which I think is a totally different thing. Maladministration, bad tax cuts. Misconduct in office, the use of a valid power for stupid reasons and possibly even invalid reasons. Abuse of power, well, that's Ukraine. That's, in fact, you don't even have to get to as far as Ukraine. That's using the tariff schedule to leverage trademarks for yourself and your kids in China. That's give me an Ivanka Trump massage parlor trademark in exchange for I will change my mind about steel tariffs so that you can send us more crap from China. That's abuse of power. But if you want to get beyond that, if you don't think that's abuse of power somehow, we can get all the way to the Ukraine example. And of course, you all know the story of Ukraine. 3 different standards, really, not difficult to understand, analogous to standards of proof, like preponderance of the evidence, beyond a reasonable doubt, et cetera, reasonable suspicion. Those are all fairly simple things to understand. They're all gradients of the same thing. So I found that pretty simple to distinguish, and I'm surprised that Republicans continued to pretend to be so enthralled by his fantastic arguments, especially when they finally realized or had laid out for them that all he's doing is saying He's repackaging the discredited notion that if the president does it, then it's not illegal. And that was surprising to see people not realize that either. Mike Musson had a comment here that we can add to the mix here. The Dershowitz argument, he says, of the will of the voters fails to acknowledge the importance of protecting the minority as well. That's true. The motive argument is irrelevant. You don't get to commit a crime just because you really want to do it. That's true too. I think we disposed of the motive argument using the fact pattern pretty well the other day, and in case it needs reiteration, if you're worried about trying to divine the president's motivation, the circumstantial evidence here can help you a great deal. I mentioned the other day when we watched Mike Tracy, who not very many of you have a tremendous amount of respect for, so forget that he said it, but except that he represents some people who might otherwise be favorably imposed to removing Trump from office, saying, well, maybe that's a good point. It does become difficult to separate politics from policy in a number of areas, not the least of which is foreign policy. But it becomes easier to do when there are protocols in place that are designed to prevent the kind of corruption that we worry about rising to the level of impeachability. And if you, as we've discussed on the show a number of times, if you actively evade protocols, that by itself doesn't necessarily mean you're guilty of holding some particular motive, but it does give rise to a fair presumption that there's some wrongdoing here. And here we make analogies to how you can instruct juries in a trial. Excellent question from Sheldon Whitehouse yesterday, sort of hit on the same subject, that if you were an Article III court and you guys were really jurors, wouldn't it be in order, Sheldon Whitehouse asked, to instruct the jury that it was fair to infer from one side's refusal to provide a witness that they were afraid of what that witness was going to say? And yes, it is. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Networks Radio. Let's see if I can find some information about Sheldon Whitehouse's question, just to give you something to link to in today's summary. And I don't know. I'll look and see, did anybody call it out as on Twitter? Well, I'll look later, but I'll keep this one open so that I can remind myself that I want to look for it later. But the question was, again, just to refresh your memory here so we can finish up the argument, whether or not jurors in a regular courtroom trial would be entitled to draw an inference of, well, any kind of inference, but a particular an inference of guilt from the refusal by a party in control of a witness or documents to refuse to produce them when it seems clear that those documents, the fact that they might be exculpatory or they might be damning, but the refusal to produce them, can't you presume from that? Aren't you entitled to take a negative inference here? And the answer is yes, you are. That's the practice. And you don't have to, but you're entitled to. You probably should. It makes a lot of sense. Why else would they refuse to produce something like that? If you've got nothing to hide here, then don't hide it, right? And that's usually kind of a troubling formulation of it. But when you're at trial and look, your life or liberty is at stake here, and we're opening up the doors and saying, bring everything you've got. Once you've been indicted and you're charged and you're on trial, the what have you got to hide question takes on a different tenor. Anyway, then say the general public, otherwise it's asking them to prove a negative, I suppose. But the point of Whitehouse's question, or my interest in Whitehouse's question, I guess, was when we come to the question of presumptions. So my argument is that if you evade protocols for policymaking that are put in place for the purpose of maintaining enough transparency that the public should be able to discern the difference between your pursuit of pecuniary interest or any other improper interest, interests, in other words, other than the best interest, the public interest of the United States as president or whatever office you might occupy, as long as it's federal. If you don't maintain enough transparency that we're able to tell the difference between a proper motive and an improper motive, or at least be able to discern whether those mixed motives exist, are you entitled to the presumption that there's a motive for that? Are you entitled to assume that there must be some wrongdoing here? Otherwise, you're merely inviting trouble for yourself for no good reason by evading protocols that aren't really all that demanding in particular, and which themselves, if you comply with them, will go a long way in court or any legal setting to proving that your motivations were sufficiently in the public interest, at the very least, such that you would be able to get away with it. Even if you have mixed motives, the fact that you laid it all out, laid it all bare, followed the protocol, informed the people who needed to be informed, gave reasons when you were asked to give reasons, and those reasons were sound and demonstrable as true, or at least perceivably true, then you can slide on these things. We may not nail you dead to rights every time you do something wrong, and we might nail you on something, it's possible, or we might bring you in for questioning or drag you into an impeachment based on a false assumption on our part. Now we have a trial and see if we can figure it out. And, we also, I know we like to think theoretically we've designed our system better that that 100 guilty men go free than one innocent man, and we're just being sexist about it outright because we're using the archaic forms here. But better that 100 guilty people go free than one innocent person lose their liberty improperly. Well, but we also know that the truth is that the criminal justice system in this case is a line drawing exercise, and we have to say, all right, occasionally we're going to get things wrong, but for the sake of stability and finality, we're going to have to say, if you're convicted in a court of law and a jury of your peers finds you guilty, but you're really not, that's bad. Now, we'll give you all sorts of opportunities to try and reverse it, and not all of them are really very good, and the odds are terrible, but you take what you can get, I guess. We have to, but at a certain point we say, well, this person will now be treated as guilty, even if we all don't think that the trial went very well. We left it to these people, and this is what they did. And unless you can show that they did something improper at appeal, then we're stuck with it. And the same thing applies here. If you won't follow the transparency protocols, and they're very easy in most cases, and in the case of Ukraine, again, we've been over this, the question is, did you notify Congress? I was doing this because I was concerned about corruption in Ukraine. There's 1,000 reasons, 1,000 ways to attack that. You were never concerned about corruption anywhere, ever, before this. You were certainly never interested in corruption in Ukraine before this point, before Joe Biden becomes a threat to you. You had no interest in Burisma. You had no interest in Hunter Biden. You might not even have known who he was. Doesn't even rise to the level of the top, 100 cases of corruption in Ukraine. You couldn't find me, the Ukrainian, who would tell me that Hunter Biden was a problem. And even if you told them who Hunter Biden was and told them he was taking in 83,000, 50,000, the numbers are differing now. But take the bigger number, $83,000 a month. I think that's between him and a business partner, the $83,000 figure that Pam Bondi was playing with the other day. $83,000 a month. They would say, we have a serious culture of corruption here in Ukraine. $83,000 a month. I'd love to have it, but that's not a lot of money in the corruption game. There are people taking millions a month. We should be going after those guys. And I mean, there's even articles on, the Kyiv Post had something I found, the top, corruption cases of 2018. Hunter Biden's not on it. Burisma isn't even on it. And you'd have an argument that I'm sure you could find me some Ukrainians who would say, yeah, Burisma, they were actually fairly corrupt. But down to individual members of the board, I don't think so. Anyway, so there's all sorts of factual attacks you could level against the argument about, well, I'm doing it because I'm worried about corruption in Ukraine. Or I'm doing it because I'm worried about the truth of the 2016 elections. All of that, very interesting. All of that very debatable. But ultimately, you don't even have to spend that much time on that stuff, although people like to use them as distractions. If the president had said, I'm just now becoming interested in corruption in Ukraine, and it is because of Burisma, and it is because of Hunter Biden, and it is because of Joe Biden, and it is because of CrowdStrike. Those things are motivating me. And or burden sharing by the European Union, and waste, fraud, and abuse. I don't know, whatever else. All of those ideas that are easily refuted. If the president had said, and so therefore, I would like to implement a program review. I want to stop the money. All you have to do here is, at the moment, anyway, at the initial stages, is say, I will comply with the Impoundment Control Act. I will notify Congress. They had a hand in this. Even the President's Counsel yesterday acknowledged, thank you very much, Pat Philbin, that there was a role for Congress in foreign policy. For instance, they appropriate things and control the purse strings. But that's stupid. Whatever. At least he admitted that it was there, and that's the role, the money spending. And so when you screw with that role, you need to tell them, I'm screwing with your role. Otherwise, the presumption that is, you're doing it in secret. You're doing it to hide it from Congress. It must have an illicit purpose. Am I not entitled to assume that? Yes, you are. Just like Sheldon Whitehouse's example. You're allowed to make an inference from the fact that, especially when the steps are so easy, the fact that you avoided them means something. Now, the steps are easy, but of course, the reason you wouldn't use them, besides the one good reason why you would want to not use the steps that isn't nefarious by itself is, well, I'll lose. Well, yeah, you will, because the law says this is what you're supposed to do. The law says the appropriations ordinarily go through. Well, not if I have a solid policy reason with which a wide or a large majority of members of Congress who appropriated the money would agree. Well, that's right. If you have a reason that you can convince them to agree with, you'll get away with it, even if you actually had nefarious intent in mind. But if you can give a plausible explanation that convinces Congress, who has a role in this, then you can stop the money. Whereas if you don't, and you know it, and you say, well, I will say a dumb reason, and they will see that it's dumb, and they will disagree, and I will lose, that's not a valid reason for keeping it secret. I'm not certain I can think of any valid reasons for keeping it secret, but then when you're questioned about it, I suppose if you have one, offer it. And they thought, well, concern about corruption, is it? Well, see, now we get to fight with you about the reasons that you're offering. No, that can't possibly be it. Well, it's burden sharing. Well, no, that's not it either. Well, it's, I don't know, waste, fraud, and abuse. No, that can't be it either. All right, fine. You caught me. Now here you're entitled to the presumption of if all the supposedly maybe possibly valid reasons, if you believed them, don't work because you're able to prove that they aren't true and you no longer believe them, are you then entitled to say, well, since we haven't actually hit upon the reason yet that is valid, that maybe there's a reason behind it which is invalid? Yeah, you could, especially if it's bolstered by circumstantial evidence that suggests that's exactly what happened. So you're entitled to make those inferences. I mean, of course, Dershowitz says you're not even entitled to be asked what your thinking is on this because whatever presidents do is in the national interest, period, and you can't impeach anybody for anything. And he's erased the impeachment clause from the Constitution just as surely as the NRA has erased the well-regulated militia part from the Second Amendment. Anyway, well, that's the problem with it all. It's not hard to differentiate. It doesn't worry me in the least that we'll have difficulty deciding where the line falls in the future because, one, these are hard questions, and nobody's going to convince me that you've got the magic solution that's going to make the Constitution easy to interpret in all cases forever going forward right now. The document was, I think, drafted with the idea in mind that this is going to pose some hard questions. Maybe, as a matter of fact, we are so clear on the fact that it's going to raise some hard questions, and some instances in which you're going to have the executive and the legislative at loggerheads, an immovable object and an irresistible force will meet. What if we included a third article in this Constitution with a third branch in it that was dedicated to nothing more than settling those disputes? Well, not just those disputes, but all sorts of disputes. But that's it. We need a dispute settlement branch. Why? Well, because we anticipate disputes. Well, why would you anticipate disputes if everything's easy, right? Oh, no, it's not easy. There's going to be some hard questions. We're going to dedicate an entire article to what to do when you run into really hard questions. And people whose job it will be to settle really hard questions. That's a pretty good indication that it was supposed to be difficult, and exercises that erase the difficulty, except they create the difficulty of conscience, of having to live under such a system. But an exercise like Dershowitz just says, don't worry about it. Not only am I going to erase part of the Constitution, which should trouble you, but all the hypotheticals that you come up with that make it hard to swallow this are to be cast aside because this is so much easier. The answer is do whatever you want. Seems to me pretty clear that it's not going to be in keeping with the intent of the founders. All right, let's see. One more comment here from Mike Musson. Probably should get out of the political theory arena for a little while and head elsewhere. But Mike says here, maybe the Republican Senate gets a perverse thrill out of getting the Chief Justice to read their question, asking one of the president's lawyers to respond with triple hearsay on hearsay on hearsay. They're really just taunting him. Oh, okay. Well, what were we? What prompted that one in particular? I'm not sure, but they seem to get a perverse thrill out of a lot of things. Rand Paul, probably the best example of that right now. He figured out a way to. I'm going to do something. He trolled everybody: C-SPAN, the country, the courts, John Roberts himself. That's going to be. I'll be interested to see whether he continues to say he's going to fight to get recognized for his question. But I'm not really sure exactly where he's going with that one. All right. Let's see. Were there other items that came up in questioning yesterday that we want to discuss? A lot of other people had some really nice observations too. Let's see. For instance, I guess looking through comments made on the Dershowitz arguments, Chris Hayes was saying, here's the ugly truth at the core of all of this. the president actually can do whatever he wants. In other words, like we were saying, we've been discussing the weird possible genius view of Doter J. Trump. Maybe he really can do whatever he wants because he's got an Article 2. Rob, cheat, steal, murder. He can do whatever he wants if he can hold 34 votes in the Senate. If 34 people are willing to say, to hell with it, you can do whatever you want, or not even necessarily that, but I'm not voting to find you guilty here, period. I don't care if it makes sense or not. Then yeah, you can get away with anything you want. Southpaw chiming in on that one and saying, by the way, you should remember by virtue of our system and our senatorial gerrymandering, if you will, by drawing state lines arbitrarily, those 34 votes might represent only 7% of the actual U.S. population, right? You need 34 votes. Take 34 votes from the least populous states, and 7% of the population gets to ratify rob, cheat, steal, and murder by the president. And of course, even if you never get to the impeachment stage, or you are an underling of the president, for instance, whom the president chooses to blame for his or her wrongdoing, but it's really going to be his wrongdoing. Well, if your channel for through the justice system we have takes you through the criminal courts, if you can appeal your case high enough up, forget 7% of the population, 5 people in America is all it takes to put their heads together to say, you know what? You also, you can't be impeached, but you're not in trouble with the law because we say you're not. That's all there is. The end. It's what you did is now legal. It says in this statute that it's illegal, but we interpret it the other way. And that's all there is to it. We just say that. Does it make any sense? No, it doesn't. Do we say it anyway? Yes, we do. To jump forward a little bit more here, I don't want to lose my place in this scroll, but more recently, I noticed that I guess Brian Beutler responding to, of all people, Frank Luntz in all this. So it puts it even more bluntly, what we were just discussing here. I don't know what... So Frank Luntz playing, or he's retweeting the ABC News tweet, which contains the video of Alan Dershowitz arguing, if a president does something which he believes will help him get elected in the public interest, that cannot be the kind of quid pro quo that results in impeachment. Luntz saying, I have yet to see anyone sincerely defending this argument. And I think for the most part, that is true. There aren't a lot of senators who, even those who intend and have announced their intention from the beginning to vote that the president is not guilty and vote not to remove him and to vote not to hear witnesses, et cetera, et cetera. Even, I guess, Luntz's point is even those people aren't saying that Dershowitz is right here. They're not sincerely defending this argument. Brian points out, rather, I think correctly, it doesn't have to be sincere. Their votes will be their defense of the proposition. Just to clarify a little bit more, he's right. An insincere vote is still what it is. That is, it's a vote. I mean, if you say not guilty and 34 of you or more say not guilty, and I say, but that's insincere. I heard you yesterday say you didn't believe that argument. Yes. Now they might try to say, but that's not what I based my vote on. But what if they say, and that is what I based my vote on? But that doesn't make any logical sense. How could you say that you don't believe that argument and mean it sincerely and then vote and say, I voted this way because of that argument, because I do believe it, even though I really don't believe it? I can't have that vote invalidated. Even in this context, I can't turn to the Chief Justice and say, Mr. Chief Justice, you shouldn't accept this vote. This senator just said he doesn't believe Mr. Dershowitz. And yet, today, he votes not guilty. And I asked him why, and he said, because Dershowitz, that can't be right. Don't count that vote. And the Chief Justice will say, I don't really have anything for you. He's a senator. He voted. It doesn't matter why he votes that way. It doesn't matter whether you believe him. It doesn't matter whether he believes himself. The vote is the vote. That's it. That says one scratch mark in the not guilty column, regardless of whether it's sincere or not. And if all 34 plus of them are totally insincere, they're still votes. Votes don't have moral values. Votes don't have consciences. They're not people. They are what they are. They're votes. Did they come to that conclusion invalidly? Yes. You can't even, and I don't think, now that I'm thinking about it, in this country, I guess we've debated this once in a while. I don't know what sort of jurisprudence there is on it, except to say that it never works. But if you prove bribery charges against a senator, right? I mean, forget what usually happens, what normally happens. They might resign. They might be expelled from the body. We don't know. But in the meantime, what you can't do, for instance, is say, all right, I have ironclad proof. In fact, we've already won the case. He's been convicted. This Senator Smith took money from Exxon to vote no on this new energy bill, the Green New Deal, whatever it is. You pick it. And he didn't really believe that the Green New Deal shouldn't have passed. And he really believes in climate change. But they gave him $1 billion and he took it and he changed his vote to no. You can convict him. You can put him in jail. You can expel him from the Senate. But can you say, and that Green New Deal bill failed by one vote? And can we now erase that vote and make it a tie, and the vice president will break the tie and the Green New Deal passes? No. We can't. It's one of our line drawing exercises is he's been granted the power by virtue of his winning the election. Whether he cheated or not is another question. I suppose you could try and invalidate his election, but all you'll win out of that is if you manage to prevail in court. Okay, maybe we'll declare the office vacant at this point, but we don't undo all the things he did and all the votes he cast. We've never done that anywhere in any part of the United States, as far as I'm aware. And I think I've looked around for that to some extent. Maybe the last time would be in law school, but I've looked around. We don't undo stuff like that. So it never enters the process. We never entertain the question of whether or not a vote is sincere or not. That's just, I don't know how else to put it. And I think I've probably beaten it to death, but we've done it a number of times in a number of different settings, right? When we talk about legal realism, Armando was on and we discussed this stuff, and we say 5 votes is all it takes. Yeah, but wouldn't they need to have precedent and da-da-da? They like to have it. But there's nothing that says absolutely, there's nothing that invalidates the vote of a Supreme Court justice if they don't write their reasons out. They don't give a reason, or they don't write their dissent, or they don't write their, well, in this case, it would be a concurrence. They never explain themselves, and no one explains themselves. There's no opinion attached to it. This is just it. This is 5-0. You don't have to do it. And there's no appeal from that. But they're supposed to give us an opinion. They are, but they didn't do it. Damn, that's disturbing. Yeah, well, that's the way it is. Now, they try not to do that. And I suppose, part of the reason, ironically enough, is I guess at some point they said, well, the norms are these, and you usually give an opinion, and it's extraordinarily important for the stability of the country that you give a reason for the way you vote and count up the votes and tell us who voted how. Because if you don't, that's the Senate might consider that not good behavior, and you might be impeached, because you might be, you might not be. Of course, if there's no such thing as impeachable conduct, or maybe it's only no such thing as impeachable conduct for presidents, but secretaries, cabinet secretaries and judges can still get impeached for all sorts of things. I don't know. By the way, the fact that the impeachment clause as it pertains to judges, or rather, I guess I should say the tenure in office clause as it pertains to judges, is that they will remain in office during periods of good behavior, which, by the way, I think implicates that middle strata of conduct above maladministration to misconduct in office. It falls there. Think about that. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, and I've learned that I either need to update these announcements more often or stop saying that the announcements are brand new. What's not new is that this message, too, is a call for your support in keeping the Kagro in the Morning show on the air. My thanks go out to all of you who do support the show through your donations. The stats say that Kagro in the Morning fans download our program about 2,000 times each weekday, but our donors make up only about 8% of our daily listeners. Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple to make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. If we're helping keep you sane during the Trump era, consider what that's worth. $1 a day? 50 cents? One thin dime? We do about 20 shows a month, so pick a number, do the math, and head to Patreon.com/KagroX to let us know. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning show here on Roots Radio. All right, I said it was time to get out of the political theory arena. I assume this is extraordinarily boring, but I don't know for sure. I enjoy it, and I don't know, you're fans, so maybe you are here because you enjoy the same things as me, but maybe not. But every once in a while, I fascinate myself with the intricacies and hidden genius is what it looks like. Not mine. Hidden genius in the Constitution. But I realized we left off at one of those points. As we dashed out the door for this break, I mentioned the three standards of misconduct, I guess, that we were talking about before. Maladministration, misconduct in office versus abuse of power. And it seems like maybe the Constitution's language on the lifetime tenure of federal judges is limited by periods of good behavior, is what they say. You know, they'll enjoy office during periods of good behavior. I forget exactly how they put it, but that's the language, which suggests perhaps there is a different standard for impeachment and removal from office for judges than there might be for presidents. And does that make sense if you are using, the same word, that you can impeach judges? Although, do they even say that they can impeach judges? They just say that all federal officials can, are subject to impeachment. And I guess there's probably an early question about whether or not that applies to Article 3 judges. And they figured that it did, and that impeachment must be the mechanism by which you would remove a judge from the bench. And, why would you do it? Because they are no longer in a period of good behavior, I guess. And so you might argue that misconduct in office might be enough to justify impeachment for a judge, but might not be enough to justify impeachment for a president. I mean, it could be. And that, of course, that's where you get right down to the realism question. Does a majority of the House of Representatives think that it is? Well, then it is, at least in this instance, this kind of misconduct in office. And maybe it's a precedent, maybe it isn't. I guess as we were talking about earlier in the show, I'm not too worried necessarily, I guess at a certain level, about the precedent set by accepting what Dershowitz has to say. Now, here's the backhanded reason why I'm not worried about the precedent. The precedent will never apply to a Democratic president. It's never going to be the case that these Republicans will apply this precedent equally to Democrats. They will say now that no matter what a president does, they can't be impeached. They will say later that, there really are things. In fact, there's a million things. Or I never even said that other thing about presidents. This Democratic president can be impeached for anything. And we told you we were going to get you. Philbin told you what goes around comes around. So here we are. We told you we were going to be out targeting you. But that's inconsistent and illogical and hypocritical. Yep, and here are the votes. Now what are you going to do? Oh, crap. Remember, we just decided that it doesn't matter whether the votes are hypocritical or not. They're votes. Here they are. Oh, I guess we lose. Sometimes we're unprepared for these things. Which reminds me also that there was something yesterday. Oh, another thing I wanted to bring up was, I think, again, NYC Southpaw's observation. Yes, here it is. We'll click on it and mark it for later. Noting in one question, the House managers are invited to talk about the Trump's children's many business interests abroad, and they high-mindedly decline. In the very next question, the president's lawyers are invited to talk about Biden's son's business interests abroad, and they dive right in. Oh, well, knife to a gunfight, I guess. Nothing new necessarily in that. Let's see. Oh, yes. I want to mark the Pam Bondi video clip for inclusion as well. So I guess to wrap things up, why would it make sense to have a different standard, or to propose that a different standard ought to be available for impeachment of a federal judge versus a president? And here again, I like we'll blame it on the genius of the internal logic of the Constitution. Why is it easier to remove a judge than a president? Well, for one thing, a lot of people would just say, well, a single federal judge is just not as important, really, as a president, and that could be it. It's certainly not as disruptive to our system of governance to remove a single federal judge, even if it's a justice of the Supreme Court, even if it's a chief justice of the Supreme Court, for that matter, versus removing a president. But another reason might be, well, again, we say they enjoy tenure in office for life during periods of good behavior. Well, a life appointment makes it perhaps, gives us more reason to worry about the potential for corruption than a term in office, particularly now that it's limited to 2 4-year terms in office, provided they obey the Constitution. And if they don't, that's the least of our problems. But yeah, somebody who can be held accountable, if by nothing else, time itself, doesn't necessarily need to be removable as easily as someone who might otherwise have a claim on a lifetime appointment. That's my thinking on that one. All right, it's time for somebody else's thinking. Mine is boring, I'm sure, at this point, and not getting to everything. So let's talk about John Bolton and his book, because I think that holds a lot of interest for people. When are we going to hear what's in this thing? And I don't know. And the answer is we may never hear it, because now the White House is interfering in things. Let's take a look at that storyline. Came to my attention when Greg Sargent tweeted yesterday. That part we all know is that the White House is holding up Bolton's book on classification grounds. Greg says, guess who's likely overseeing this process? I can't. Tell me. Answer, John Eisenberg, whose name came up all over the place, of course, in the impeachment context. I think that's the lawyer. Is that not the lawyer to whom everyone was instructed to run by Bolton himself when he discovered the drug deal that Mulvaney and who else was cooking up? Giuliani and Mulvaney. Is that who he was implicating? And somebody else? I don't remember anymore. Drug deals what stuck with me. Anyway, John Eisenberg, who buried the whistleblower complaint on a secret server. That's the same guy. Sargent says, I talked to a former NSC official about how this could work, and he produced an article as a result, which gives us something to read for a good portion of the next few minutes of the show. Let's do that. How the White House could keep John Bolton's book buried for now. And it is illustrated with a very disturbing photo of the still odious John Bolton. Still not my hero. And really not anybody's, as we discussed yesterday. But here's Greg's piece. President Trump has manipulated the machinery of government to serve his naked, personal and political interests. Please, don't do that to me. In so many different ways that it is difficult to ascribe the benefit of the doubt to any given move, even if there are ways to interpret it innocently. We had a new example of this on Wednesday when we learned that the White House is placing obstacles in the path of the publication of former National Security Advisor John Bolton's new book because of classification concerns. In a more functional and less corrupt White House, there would be scenarios in which this is perfectly justifiable and acceptable, but given what we've seen for years now, we can't assume this in this case. All right. CNN reports, he says, as follows. The White House has, this is my CNN voice, the White House has issued a formal threat. Oh, yes. I forgot about this story almost. The White House has issued a formal threat to former National Security Advisor John Bolton to keep him from publishing his book, The Room Where It Happened, a White House memoir. Sources familiar with the matter tell CNN. Forgot about this story. This was published, interestingly, under Jake Tapper's name on the website there. I have questions about whether, does Jake Tapper really spend time writing stories and attaching his name to it? Does he have interns do it and say, put my name on it because it's a story I'm handling as anchor? I can't believe that he spends time writing those things. And if he did, then he did a terrible job on this one. I'm willing to say I think that was handed off to somebody else and they just slapped Jake Tapper's name on it because he's covering the story. And I don't think Jake, if he had read this, would say, ooh, I don't doubt that he would say, wait a minute, this is a bad job on this. This was circulated all over Twitter yesterday with that tweet. You know, the White House has issued a formal threat. And if you read the article, which we'll read the key part here, at no point do they say what the threat is or even clarify how it was delivered beyond saying it came in a letter. And, I mean, why would you say that there's a formal threat if there's nothing formal? In what sense? They don't say. What was the threat? They don't say. I think we're meant to infer that this was a cease and desist sort of letter and that you'll find yourself in court on some sort of national security violation if you print this. But it never says. And that's really astonishing. And again, they should avail themselves of my rule. They should have said the White House has purportedly issued a formal threat. Until we see what the threat is and you share it with us, let's just say it purports it. Okay. What else have we got here? So they've purportedly issued a formal threat. In a letter to Bolton's lawyer, a top official at the National Security Council wrote the unpublished manuscript of Bolton's book, quote, appears to contain significant amounts of classified information, unquote, and couldn't be published as written. The letter, which is dated January 23rd, said some of the information was classified at the top secret level, meaning it, quote, reasonably could be expected to cause exceptionally grave harm to the national security. The manuscript may not be published or otherwise disclosed without the deletion of this classified information, the letter read. The letter to Bolton, Greg continues, whose book will recount that Trump linked military aid to Ukraine with his demand for sham investigations that would help him politically, is from the Senior Director for Records, Access, and Information Security Management at the National Security Council. I spoke with Joshua Geltzer. Remember his name came up the other day, right? Is Joshua Geltzer the law professor at Georgetown who co-wrote an article with, I can't remember who we were talking about. Yeah, his name, it is him. He came up the other day. Okay, well, Greg spoke with Joshua Geltzer, a senior, who also happens to have been a senior NSC official from 2015 to 2017, about how this would work under normal circumstances. Geltzer told me that ordinarily, the officials handling information security management at the National Security Council would do this book review, in consultation with the NSC's top lawyer. That post is occupied by one John Eisenberg. I would expect that Eisenberg and his team are at least tracking this, Geltzer told me. If that name sounds familiar, that's because Eisenberg is the lawyer who reportedly loaded Trump's call with the Ukrainian president onto an ultra-secret server after Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, then a top Ukraine advisor at the White House, sounded the alarm about it. And when officials complained to Eisenberg about the shadow Ukraine policy orchestrated by Gordon Sondland, the U.S. ambassador to the European Union, as part of Trump's extortion scheme, the New York Times reported that Eisenberg, quote, set aside these concerns and didn't raise them with the president. Eisenberg also defied a subpoena and refused to show up for questioning before the House impeachment inquiry. It's difficult to know what Eisenberg's role involving Bolton's book will look like or what it will mean. As Geltzer told me, there are scenarios in which this could play out innocently. If so, Geltzer said, a dialogue would ordinarily take place between Bolton and NSC staff that would resolve the council's classification concerns in good faith, producing language that worked for both sides. As Geltzer puts it, in such a situation, it would be a matter of pruning out classified information with a scalpel-like process. The concerns probably wouldn't derail the book's scheduled publication date of March 17th. This shouldn't become a protracted or wholesale blocking, Geltzer told me. But this is not a normal White House. And so, as Geltzer noted, two scenarios have to be considered at least as possibilities. One is that the initial objection on classification grounds was actually made in bad faith and not on a genuine assessment of information in the book. The White House has had Bolton's book since late December. White House counsel Pat Cipollone, who is leading President Trump's impeachment defense, reportedly wasn't briefed on its contents in advance, but the president's legal team has refused to say whether other White House lawyers were briefed on them. Oddly, the letter to Bolton states that his book contains significant amounts of classified information. That's a bit difficult to imagine, since you'd think Bolton would write with the pending classification review in mind. Yes, he would, of course. That claim could lay the groundwork for an overly protracted process. As Geltzer noted, if officials wanted to delay publication, they could intentionally draw this out and slow it down, perhaps by objecting to far more on classification grounds than would normally be warranted. One question here is whether Eisenberg is shaping the NSC's decision-making as to what will be permitted for publication and what will not. I'd like to think this is being done in good faith, but given the surprising approach to recusals and conflicts of interest taken by the Trump White House, one has to at least worry, Geltzer told me. They've lost the presumption that everything, they've lost the presumption of innocence a long time ago, over 100 different issues, right? I mean, just to pick one out of a hat, the redactions that DOJ approved to those emails between the OMB and the Department of Defense, that once we found unredacted versions of the emails turned out to have been baseless and, in fact, improper. And if they had been reviewed by a court, they likely would have lost that case. You would have been found to have improperly, illegally redacted that information. Well, that's a good reason why Geltzer is right, and he's putting it gently, saying, well, one has to at least worry that they might not be doing this on the up and up. Again, it's completely possible this process is entirely innocent, but this administration already has an extraordinarily long record of twisting official pronouncements to make Trump's lies true and of manipulating the machinery of government to serve his political needs. Attorney General William Barr dishonestly represented the special counsel's findings before their release, manipulating a timetable to do so. And his Justice Department and Director of National Intelligence tried to block the whistleblower complaint, which kicked off the Ukraine scandal, from reaching Congress. So we need to be on guard for the worst. Plus the emails that I was discussing. There's a million different places where this stuff is all true. So, okay, we'll keep an eye on that. And again, more, I think, about the fairness of assuming or of not having to adopt a presumption that this is being done correctly. It's always a demand the paperwork situation with Trump, and it's always a demand the paperwork situation because it's the paperwork that usually reveals that they have not been following protocol, and that by itself should give rise to suspicions of wrongdoing. You will be perfectly correct in doing that with any administration, and we wouldn't even blink at it. I give you blanket permission to assume that everything from this administration is a lie. You don't need any help in coming to that conclusion. You don't need my permission either. Okay, let's see. Other issues looming out there. There are several. I'm going to go with this one. And I can say I will probably not. This one will make us run out of time, which is fine. It's time to run out of time. Josh Lederman of NBC News tweeting out a summary of his article, which might serve us better than reading the actual article. The actual article, well, let me call it up so that I've got it and I can give you the headline and you can look for it. NBC News publication, the headline, Dutch Trump superfan who claimed he surveilled Ambassador Jovanovic told people he was DEA. Interviews, the subheader reads, with a half dozen people who know Anthony DeCalloway. And we're totally guessing at how you would pronounce this, I guess, Dutch surname. Anthony DeCalloway and documents, or people, I guess I'll start the subheader again. Interviews with half a dozen people who know Anthony DeCalloway and documents obtained by NBC News show that the Trump superfan has a shadowy past. Who is this guy? And what the hell is he up to? He is the guy with whom, remember this name, he's already been forgotten. Robert Hyde, the Connecticut 5th District, Connecticut congressional candidate, Republican contender anyway, for the Republican nomination there, who was the guy who's showing up at Mar-a-Lago all the time and saying he's the one who's telling Lev Parnas via WhatsApp that he's got a guy surveilling Marie Yovanovitch. The guy who supposedly is surveilling Yovanovitch is this Anthony DeCalloway figure. So NBC News, after we all forgot about Robert Hyde, went and did some digging on this. And maybe we're most likely to get through the tweet thread that Josh put together in this. Who is Anthony DeCalloway? It's Caluwe is the Calloway, I don't know. You tell me if you're Dutch. Who is this guy? The Trump superfan, an international man of mystery, funny, who is encrypted texts claiming to have Ambassador Jovanovic under surveillance, triggered investigations in 2 countries. Yes, remember that. They have finally launched those investigations in Ukraine, and they are investigations of Trump's wrongdoing instead. Anyway, so here goes the tweet thread. When the texts first came out 2 weeks ago, seems like 2 years ago, DeCalloway first denied sending them, then acknowledged he did, but said it was just a joke, ridiculous banter, as he said, with his friend Rob Hyde, a GOP congressional candidate he'd met at Trump events. And calling him a congressional candidate is the best possible spin on that guy, too, by the way. Little was known about DeCalloway at the time, but for hundreds of photos and posts on social media about Trump. At the time, DeCalloway and his spokeswoman said he had nothing to do with surveilling people and, quote, no connection to Ukraine. Our NBC News investigation from me and Anna Schechter, drawing on documents and interviews with half a dozen people who know DeCalloway, calls elements of that story into question. Can you believe it? I know, it's probably a huge surprise, right? 4 people who know DeCalloway said he presented himself when they met as working for the Drug Enforcement Administration. Is it administration or agency? Anyway, DEA. you know them as. He occasionally told others he was FBI or CIA. Drug ops in South America, he told Rob Hyde, is what he did for the DEA. Photos obtained by NBC News showed DeCalloway wearing what appears to be a DEA badge. One person said he flashed it when he identified himself to new people as a DEA agent and sought information about drug cases he was purportedly investigating. DeCalloway told at least 2 people that his dog, a Dalmatian named Maximus, was trained to sniff out drugs. Photos show that he dressed the dog in a harness, identifying it as a DEA police canine. He said he was with the DEA and all that. Law enforcement, said Leland McKee, a frequent Mar-a-Lago guest that DeCalloway pitched on his tracking software. He was trying to solicit money. Can you believe it? He just showed up at Perva-Lago trying to solicit money. Where did he get that idea? He was trying to solicit money from anyone he could get money from, and I knew there was something not quite right. Nothing quite right about you hanging out at Mar-a-Lago, but okay. Thanks, Leland. 2 people who know DeCalloway separately voiced concern he could be a threat to Trump. What kind of threat? I'm not sure. Because of what they described as a fanatical dedication. And I'm not certain whether they mean he could be a threat to Trump because he's so fanatically dedicated to him that he would freelance and do dumb stuff and get Trump in trouble, or he's so fanatical about Trump that if somehow Trump disappointed him, he would have a mental breakdown and possibly assassinate him or something like that. I'm not certain what they mean. Maybe the article is clearer on it, but we'll never get through the article. I might never get through this tweet thread if I don't keep going. Others described him as a fantastical storyteller who tended to make up stories, especially after drinking. I guess one thing is, that sounds, I guess that's meant to make him sound more harmless, but why is everyone around Trump one of these guys? Well, that's because Trump is effed up. All right, anyway, DeCalloway also told people about a tech company he was starting that could track people or objects through RFID. 4 people who know him say in an online profile, he identified one of his projects as Track and Trace New IT Tech Company. He tried to get one person he knows to install an app connected to a keychain-sized RFID tracking tag, but they declined out of concern he'd use it to track them. His spokeswoman says it's not used for surveilling people, just locating items. But that already exists. We don't need another one of those. I guess you can always have competitors. DeCalloway has repeatedly claimed, quote, no connection to Ukraine, but NBC learned that he was dating a Ukrainian woman, that would be a connection, who lives in Belgium, but returns regularly for long stretches to Ukraine. At the same time, and I guess one of those long stretches was at the same time that he was sending those texts about Yovanovitch. Presented with this information by NBC News, DeCalloway's spokeswoman acknowledged the relationship, but said, although she is of Ukrainian descent, this is in no way a direct connection to the country of Ukraine. Online, DeCalloway claimed to have run a long list of companies involved in private banking, financial advising, real estate development, energy and space exploration. That is a list of things that will very often get people to give you money if you say you have a budding adventure in those areas, not necessarily anything that he has real expertise in. I can see that much. Most appear to be flashy websites with stock images, no evidence that they conducted any actual business. DeCalloway also tweeted a screenshot supposedly of Donald Trump, tweeting praise about him and calling him a true patriot. But Trump never actually sent that tweet, and the screenshot may have been photoshopped. It's still unclear whether there was any actual surveillance of Yovanovitch. There is no evidence that has emerged to date of a real monitoring operation. That's nice. But NBC News learned that the FBI has been sharing info on DeCalloway with multiple countries. The U.S. Embassy, which U.S. Embassy, I'm not sure, has also reached out to him, maybe the embassy in Ukraine. His spokeswoman says he's cooperating. Ukraine and the State Department say they're jointly investigating the potential Yovanovitch surveillance. Here's DeCalloway in his statement last week on the texts, quote, I truly love what the president is doing for America. That is how my friendship with Rob began. I'm apologetic for contributing to any confusion through these communications. And lastly, we are admonished to read the entirety of the article and given a link to it, and you should do that. Remember, again, if you want to take a look at it offline later on, Dutch Trump superfan who claimed he surveilled Ambassador Yovanovitch told people he was DEA. It's always a fantasy with these guys that they'll be, part of the deep state. I wonder why that is. Anyway, time to hand things over to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. Hope I didn't bore you to death with today's political science investigation. What has he got online for you? Well, it's all the stuff we didn't get to today. Adam Schiff fired back after Jay Sekulow threatened that the impeachment trial would be put on a pike. The House Democrats called for $760 billion in infrastructure spending over 5 years to repair sagging roads and bridges. NASA is pulling the plug on the Spitzer Space Telescope after 16 years of scanning the universe with infrared eyes. And NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell was unable to say the Rooney Rule is not
From
working.
Daily Kos Radio,
but did admit the
on
league
networksradio.com.
needs change in its minority hiring policy.
To the Kagro in the Morning Show.
With David Waldman.
Well, you know you're listening to this. What else have we got? Internationally, Tokyo prosecutors issued an arrest warrant for Carlos Ghosn for illegally leaving the country, along with warrants for a former U.S. Special Forces soldier and another person suspected of smuggling the former Nissan Motor Company boss out of Japan. Fascinating story. Stay tuned.